Public Affairs Channel.
Dr. Richard Haass is the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, a position he has held for more than a decade. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he was Principal Advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. From 1989 to 1993, he was Special Assistant to President George H.W. Bush and Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. Previously, he served in the Departments of State and Defence and was a legislative aide in the US Senate. Dr. Haass has had a range of academic appointments at Harvard University's Kennedy School, Hamilton College and the University of Oxford. He holds the State Department's Distinguished Honour Award, the Presidential Citizens Medal and the Tipperary International Peace Award. Tonight, Dr. Haass will be speaking on rethinking US foreign policy. There are few more debated or consequential issues than the future of the United States and its role in this region. In the current period, US power in Asia is being challenged more vigorously than it has arguably been since the end of the Second World War. Amidst the Obama administration's announcement of a rebalancing of US power towards the Asia-Pacific, we have recent news of a downsizing or a planned downsizing of America's armed forces. These are pressing issues, not only for a close ally of the United States like Australia, but for the region as a whole. And for these reasons, we await eagerly to hear what Dr. Haass has to say to us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Haass.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here. For me, it's a personal pleasure to also to be at a university that's so closely associated with Hedley Bull. When I was a student at Oxford doing my doctorate, I worked closely with Hedley, and he had as much influence as anyone else on what I am. So if you like what I say, attribute it to Hedley. If you don't like what I say, don't blame it. Don't blame him. But he is, I think, really one of the great men of the field. I want to thank Michael for that introduction. It's good to be here at IPS. Do you call it that? There we go. And also associated with my buddy Bates Gill and the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney. What I want to do is talk about American foreign policy. I won't go on forever. I'll try to save a good chunk of our time for your questions and comments. Let me try to give the setting. The United States and U.S. foreign policy for 4 decades had a compass. And the compass was containment. And that was essentially the intellectual lodestar that helped the United States navigate the dangerous and unfamiliar world and landscape that was the Cold War. Now, containment could survive many things, and did. The one thing it couldn't survive was its success. So 25 years ago, indeed we marked literally 25 years ago this November, when the Berlin Wall was dismantled, with it essentially was the dismantling of the intellectual foundation, to switch metaphors for a second, of American foreign policy. And over the last quarter century, the United States has attempted to navigate a world essentially called a post-Cold War world, and it's called that because it still hasn't quite settled. People in our business call things post when they haven't figured out what it is. Trust me, one of my colleagues will, his speaking fees or her speaking fees will go up dramatically when this title, some new title for this period of history is developed and accepted. But the United States has gone through this era without an intellectual compass, without any successor, if you will, to containment. Now, partially it's because, again, the nature of the era. In order to have a doctrine in many ways, you have to have a degree of predictability. And whatever else this era of history is, it's not predictable. And so on one level, it's not surprising we haven't had an intellectual construct to take the place of containment. But the other reason has less to do with the world than it does with the United States. Essentially, in order to have an intellectual compass or construct your foreign policy, you not only need a degree of predictability externally, but you need a considerable degree of consensus internally. And American foreign policy simply has lacked such a domestic, political, and intellectual consensus. And indeed, to the contrary, what we have often seen in the United States over these 25 years is a resurfacing of many of the traditional debates in American foreign policy that have informed the discourse for decades, or in some cases, even centuries. And on one hand, you've had what you might call a revival of Wilsonianism. Woodrow Wilson, president, as you know, around the time of World War I. Wilson was the one with the 14 points, a fairly idealistic notion of international relations, and very concerned with conditions within other societies. And in many ways, Wilson is the intellectual father, or one of the intellectual fathers, of everything from the pro-democracy movement to humanitarian intervention to human rights, but an entire school of American foreign policy that has grown up and evolved over the decades or longer, that said a principal aim of American foreign policy has to be to promote values and to change the nature of other societies, to affect conditions within the borders of other countries around the world. And this is something that's not particular to Democrats or Republicans. It crosses party lines. So you've seen it in recent decades, say Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and so forth. This is a recurring feature, shall we say, in American foreign policy. And juxtaposed against it often is what's traditionally referred to as realism. And by contrast, realism puts much greater emphasis not on conditions within borders, but on behavior beyond them. Or another way of restating the realist premise is that the principal purpose and business of American foreign policy ought to be to shape the foreign policies of others rather than their internal nature. Now, the two are not mutually exclusive, don't get me wrong, but there is a significant degree of difference, because there is a significant degree or difference in emphasis. And realism, like idealism or Wilsonianism, again, crosses party lines. And there's been Democrat practitioners or adherents of it, as well as Republicans. What's happened, though, I think, over the last decade in particular, after 9/11, and beginning with the 2003 war in Iraq, a war that I described as a war of choice, and then continuing, among other things, with the decision, particularly by the current president, to dramatically increase U.S. force levels in Afghanistan and to broaden the purpose of U.S. presence in Afghanistan, from counterterrorism to something much more. And then most recently with events in the Middle East, since the self-immolation of a Tunisian vegetable or fruit vendor, and where the United States has, in serial fashion, articulated fairly ambitious goals for regime change in places like Egypt, in places like Syria, in places like Libya. We've had this intensification of this debate between the realists and the idealists. And we've now had another wrinkle join it. As if two schools were not enough, contending, we've now got a third school. This too, though, is historically familiar, and in some ways was perhaps the predictable reaction to what happened in Iraq and what happened in Afghanistan, which I've described as overreach. We now have the resurgence of American underreach which is just a wonky word for isolationism. So what we're beginning to see in the American body politic now are these three schools, all of whom have their intellectual and political antecedents, once again contest for the direction of American foreign and policy. And that is where we are, 25 years, if you will, after the end of the Cold War and after the retirement, so to speak, of containment. Depending upon who you got to speak today, you would probably then, even if people agreed with what I said, depending upon who you invited to speak, you'll get then a very different sense of where American foreign policy should go. But since you invited me to speak, you're going to get my sense where American foreign policy should go against this backdrop of intellectual and political competition. So let me sort of argue what I would, which is we've got to set it up one other way, which is what should be U.S. aims in the world? The first question, what is it we're trying to achieve, where and how? So that's a foreign policy debate against these backdrops, these three schools of thought, and particularly between the realists and idealists. That's, if you will, a classic foreign policy debate. And then you have the debate is how important should foreign policy be? Which is less of a foreign policy debate in some ways than it is a national security debate. It's really saying what proportion of our calories, our time, our resources, our efforts, should we devote to things beyond our borders as opposed to things within. So we're also having a debate there, which is again the debate between, if you will, internationalism, whatever form it may take, and isolationism. So what we've got again are fundamental debates going on in the United States. So if you're noticing sitting here in Canberra and Australia more broadly, what seems to be some inconsistency or some confusion in American foreign policy, there's not anything wrong with you. That's the reality. You're seeing that because it exists. So what I want to talk to you is what I think ought to be the balances, first of all, within the foreign policy debate, if you will, between the Wilsonians and the realists, and then second, in the more fundamental national security debate between the internationalists and the isolationists. On the first, the foreign policy debate, to use a word that's pretty commonly known out here, I would say the time has come, indeed it's long since come, to rebalance American foreign policy. And I would argue it ought to be rebalanced in two ways. One is geographic, which is away from the Middle East. Now, let's get our metaphors right. I'm not talking about a switch. I'm not saying the United States should withdraw from the Middle East and just focus on this part of the world. But I do believe we ought to dial down. And the word in America is kind of rheostat. It's like adjusting something. We ought to dial down our involvement in the Middle East and dial it up elsewhere, particularly in this part of the world, the Asia Pacific. It's here much more, I believe, than anywhere else where the history of the 21st century is going to be written. This is where the major powers of this era are going to congregate. In the previous century, the major powers mostly congregated in Europe. That's not going to be the case this time around. They're not going to congregate in the Middle East. Indeed, there are no major powers in the Middle East. The Middle East is much more characterized by weak states than strong states. So I do believe there's a powerful intellectual argument that the focus geographically of American foreign policy ought to be out here, but also for another reason. The kinds of tools that the United States has to bring to bear in foreign policy, diplomatic, economic, military, are exactly what is called for in this part of the world. If your goal is to influence, say, the foreign policy of a China or a Japan or any other country, we're pretty good at that. We have the economic, the diplomatic, military tools to influence the behavior of countries beyond their borders. In the Middle East, however, that's not the principal concern. The principal concern has been to more influence the nature of countries within their borders, and that's something our tools are not as good at. Indeed, more than 2 million Americans served in either Iraq or Afghanistan, and I don't believe we have results that in any way are commensurate with that investment. And it ought to give us a degree of humility, that if your goal is to re-engineer other societies, you may need to lower your sights. There's nothing more difficult in the foreign policy business than trying to change the nature of other societies, changing the behavior of others. Their foreign policy is, I think, an order of magnitude less difficult, not to be confused with easy, but an order of magnitude less difficult. So what this argues for is a focus on Asia, because I believe our interests are objectively greater, and our ability to influence or advance those interests is objectively more compared to the situation in the Middle East. And so my view is the United States ought not to just articulate a pivot or a rebalance towards Asia, but we ought to affect it. We ought to bring it about. And what that would mean more specifically is a greater devotion of diplomatic time to try to prevent, or if they happen all the same, manage potential crises in this part of the world. It ought to be economically to bring about a new trade agreement in this part of the world, and we ought to increase our military presence, particularly our air and naval presence in this part of the world. I think that ought to be the principal rebalancing of our foreign policy. In addition, I would say a slightly greater emphasis on North America. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, right now, North America, essentially the United States, Canada, Mexico, is a region of something like 450 million people, soon to be 500 million people. It's energy self-sufficient. Indeed, it's going to become, it's on the verge of becoming a net energy exporter. It's more and more integrated economically because of the NAFTA trade agreement. And if there's any part of the world that I believe has the ability to be a sustained economic engine for the rest of the world, it is North America. So I believe the United States ought to be focusing much more on its own region. And I also believe the United States ought to be focusing more on trying to narrow the gap between global challenges, everything from proliferation, climate change, infectious and non-infectious disease, the operation of an open world monetary and trading system, the management of the internet and cyberspace, that there's an enormous gap between these challenges and the arrangements in place meant to manage them. And another focus of our foreign policy ought to be on just that. So that's what I would essentially argue for, a rebalance away from the Middle East and the remaking of that part of the world, much more towards trying to maintain stability out here, integrating North America even more, and trying to narrow the global gap between international challenges that in many ways help define this era and the rules, consensus, and arrangements in place meant to contend with them. So that's what I would do on the foreign policy side of life. That would be the rebalancing that I think the United States needs. The other area of rebalancing is, as I said, between what is domestic and international, which is in some ways, you think about it, it's the other side of the national security coin. You know, take this image. The national security, what the United States of Australia, has two dimensions. One side of the coin is what you do beyond your borders. That's your foreign policy side of national security. The other is domestically, the strength of your society, the strength of your economy, and the national security of any country, be it the United States, Australia, or anybody else, is the sum total of the two sides of that coin. And what I'm arguing here this afternoon is we need to rebalance the foreign policy side of the coin, but we also need to rebalance the relationship between the foreign policy side of the coin and the domestic policy side of the coin. I believe the United States is essentially overreached a bit abroad, as I described in the Middle East, but even more, it is underperformed at home. So much so that I actually believe the biggest threat to the United States right now is not China. It's not any of the global issues I've just referred to. It's nothing in the Middle East. It's our own political dysfunction. It's American political dysfunction that more than anything else stands in the way between the United States, where it is, and what it needs to do to advance its own national security. We've been growing for most of the last decade at roughly half the post-World War II average. We're going to pick up a little bit this year. That is good, but among other things, American employment levels, the percentage of people who want to have jobs who are working is still less than it was before the 2008 financial crisis. The other day, the vice president, who sometimes gets in trouble for saying things, described the airport, one of the airports in the city I live in, New York, LaGuardia, as a third world airport. And he got roundly criticized for that, and I tweeted about it, and I said, actually, he was wrong. I spend a lot of time in the third world. Third world airports are better than LaGuardia Airport. That was quite unfair to much of the third world. And it's a question that has a real impact on American competitiveness, on the resilience of American society. Immigration, we're one of the more open countries in the world, but we're not nearly as open as we should be. Right now, we've got at times a truly nutty policy, to use a technical word, where all sorts of people come to our elite universities, present company excluded, which are the marvel of the world. And then in many cases, after they get their PhDs in the sciences, we say, thank you very much, but you can't stay here. It's one of our contributions to other societies. It's a form of foreign aid, I suppose. But again, for American competitiveness, there would be a very powerful argument for increasing the openness of our society, particularly those who are in a position, because of talent and education, to make real contributions to American society. And speaking about our education system, people line up all over the world at American embassies and consulates to go to Harvard and Stanford and Yale and Princeton and what have you, for good reason. There aren't too many people, I would expect, lining up at the consulates in this country or at the embassy here in order to go to American public schools in our cities. And the reason is obvious. They're not world class. And it's an area where American education is not competitive. So there's lots of things we need to do to improve the foundations of our economic strength, of our competitiveness, the cohesion of our society. We've also got to fix entitlements. It's a problem not unique to the United States. You've got your own challenges here. But we have an enormous problem, which is in about 6, 7, 8 years, when people of my generation are increasingly retired, their medical needs go up, the society has to pay their retirement. So the entitlement obligations are going to grow. This is going to add to the deficit at a time when the stock of debt will already have become much more expensive to service. Why? Because interest rates are likely to be considerably higher at that time than they are now. I don't know how much higher, but I know they're not going to be lower. And so this combination of increased demand for entitlements and much higher rates is an enormous drag on the American economy, but it's also a form of vulnerability. It's quite ironic. We have moved ourselves from tremendous dependency in the energy realm to self-sufficiency. At the same time, we're moving ourselves increasingly into vulnerability when it comes to our need on a daily basis for dollars. And this puts us at the mercy of central bankers, markets, or both. So my argument is the United States needs to do much more at home. Now, don't get me wrong. This is not an argument for isolationism. To the contrary, we need to do more at home because this is the foundation of our ability to act in the world. It takes resources to act in the world. And unless our economy is sufficiently productive, we're not going to have enough resources to meet our domestic needs, including the entitlement obligations I just talked about, and to produce enough resources to be active in the world. We also need to be strong enough economically and at home, not just to compete economically, but to be able to surge resources so we can deter would-be geopolitical challenges around the world. And if deterrence doesn't work, we have to be able to deal with those challenges, to contend with them. All of that takes resources. There's also the argument that the United States, if it's a functioning economy, and better than that, if it's a thriving economy, and it's a functioning political system, it sets an example that others will want to emulate and to compete with other examples that are put forward for how countries ought to organize themselves. Or to put another way, yes, I believe, and it was the title of my recent book, that foreign policy begins at home. That's where you have to rebuild the foundations of economic power, and this is true of the United States, Australia, or anybody else. But foreign policy does not and cannot end at home. That it's again, to rebuild the foundations or restore the foundations of one's economic strength and of one's social cohesion is, yes, on one level an end in itself for standard of living and quality of life, but it's also a means to an end. Because again, you come back to the coin, by getting the domestic side of the national security coin right and robust, it frees up the resources so you can then pursue the foreign policy side of the national security coin. My last point is that I believe it is essential that the United States gets this right. But it's not simply for ourselves. We're only about, 4% or so of the world's people. We're 20, 23, give or take, % of the world's economic output. But it's for another reason. One of the characteristics of this world, as I mentioned before, is globalization and this gap between global challenges and global arrangements. Another challenge of this world, whether it's the Middle East, which is weak states, or out in this part of the world where you have several fairly strong states. Well, my argument is either at the global level or at the regional level, things just don't sort themselves out. I see a lot of students in the room. A lot of you are probably studying basic economics. 101, you study Adam Smith. You learn about the invisible hand, about how the marketplace works and all that. Well, we could have a philosophical conversation about the invisible hand in the economic marketplace and how effective it is. Let me just simply argue that there is no invisible hand in the geopolitical marketplace. Geopolitical markets just don't sort themselves out and settle, but rather it takes visible hands. And if I am right, the most significant visible hand at this moment of history is the hand of the United States. I don't see any other country or group of countries that have the inclination or the capacity to play an ordering role in a way that's respectful of the rights and interests of others. I simply, you can say certain countries have the capacity possibly, well, they don't have the inclination or the will, and others may have the will, but they don't have the capacity. Only the United States has both. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting we can do it on our own. We need partners. There's very few things the United States can accomplish on its own unilaterally. And don't get me wrong, this is not a statement of arrogance. I'm not saying we always get it right. I'm not saying we're always wonderful. We make mistakes. And indeed, I think the United States has erred in recent years in things it tried to do, in particular in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I think the recent NSA revelations, again, showed certain errors in American national security policy. So this is not an argument I hope you take as arrogance. It's simply, though, from where I stand, an assessment that there's no other country out there that's willing and able to play this kind of a role in the world. And if the United States doesn't do it, the world is likely to move in a direction or move down a trajectory that is far more dangerous and far less free and far less prosperous, not just for the United States, but for everyone, because again, the system won't work nearly as well. And in this day and age, borders are not barriers. And if there's instability in this part of the world or global issues begin to overwhelm us, no one in this country or no one anywhere else is going to be safe and sound and be able to wall themselves off from it. We can't do this by ourselves. I want to end with one or two thoughts about Australia. The United States needs partners in this enterprise. And I would think for Australia, there are then two major opportunities here. And I would suggest there are opportunities not to be done as a favor to the United States. I don't expect Australian foreign policy to be in the business of philanthropy towards Americans. I expect it to be cold, calculating realism. And I would think, but I think there's two arguments for Australia to see itself as a partner of the United States. One is in this region. If I'm right, and the Asia-Pacific is in some ways emerging as the critical region of the 21st century, it is a part of the world where you've got more disputes than you can shake a stick at, where you've got many unsettled territorial as well as psychological and political and historical questions dating back from before World War II and in the years afterwards. And while there's been a proliferation of economic institutions, there has been nothing like that on the political, military, or diplomatic side. This part of the world is, how would I put it? It's full of friction. It's friction-rich and diplomacy poor. That's a bad combination. And that's an area where I believe Australia can work with the United States in helping to narrow the gap, to help deal with some of the diplomatic challenges, to try to build some institutions, to build some arrangements, to encourage some rules of the road. And the United States is a Pacific power. We have obligations to several countries, including yourselves, but even beyond the obligations to our allies, we have interests in this part of the world, and we need partners to advance those interests. So one of them, I think, is to think about the continual evolution and development of this relationship, where together, I believe, our capacity to promote stability in the Asia-Pacific is much greater than either one of us acting on our own, much less leaving the region to its own devices. Leaving this region to its own devices, I think, is a recipe for mayhem. Secondly, at the global level, Again, the kinds of challenges I talked about before, from proliferation to terror to climate change to infectious disease to an open economic order to governing the internet, you name it. Again, these things just don't happen. And what we need for this era of history is a concerted effort to come up with rules and then to try to translate those rules into arrangements, those arrangements into institutions. Now, the model is not going to be the UN General Assembly. If we require all 192 or 3 countries, I lose count. I left the United States 4 days ago. There's probably now one more. If we wait for consensus at that level, it ain't going to happen. But it's much more realistic as a form of multilateralism to take like-minded countries with capacity and have them build, if you will, common approaches that in and of themselves are significant or could, as they snowball, become the basis for much broader and broader yet international arrangements. And that's something, again, the United States and Australia, I believe, can and should do. And that we ought to have, if you will, something of a caucus amongst ourselves and other like-minded countries, be it in this part of the world or elsewhere, whether the goal is promoting regional or, as I'm saying here, global arrangements to deal with these challenges that affect us all. And let me end with a model, and it's probably going to be controversial, but what the hell. My idea is that Australia ought to increasingly think of itself as a principal partner of the United States, not that in any way it gives up its sovereignty or its decision-making or its own discretion, but simply that by associating itself more closely, I believe that Australia can increase its influence in the region and the world. And the country I have in mind as something of a model is Britain. And that for the previous era of history, the United States and Britain had the so-called special relationship, call it what you will, but the idea is that London and Washington working together often came up with approaches for the transatlantic relationship, for Europe, but even beyond, the Middle East and elsewhere, where together the whole was, or the relationship was more than the sum of its parts. And it gave Britain a much larger role on the world stage than it would have had if it acted either independently or just through its European associations. And I think the same thing is true for the United States and Australia. That as I look at this era of history and looking at regional and global arrangements, the United States very much needs partners. Australia has enormous stakes in this part of the world and in global arrangements in general. And I think the idea of building a 21st century relationship between these two countries that's even more intimate and more significant than what exists, I believe is something that could be very much in the interest of both both countries. And that is something that I would very much like to see promoted and developed. So I end where I began. I think the United States needs to rethink its foreign policy to get the balances right in what we do in the world, as well as what we do in the world and what we do at home. But I also think there's an argument for Australia to do some similar thinking about its foreign policy and the relationship between its foreign policy and its domestic policy and how it sees its own role in the world and how it comes to define its own national security policy for the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Ready. Thank you very much. I'm David Rosenberg. I'm a visiting fellow here over at the Headley Bull Center. My question is related to a comment you made that energy production in U.S. and North America is increasing to the extent that if current trends continue, it may soon be exporting energy, oil and gas in particular. So the question is, what do you think are the foreign policy implications of that position, especially among the many energy importing countries of East Asia?
It's a good question, and it's interesting. There hasn't been a lot of really good work done on that. I mean, just to give you a sense of the economic or the energy or changes. In 2013, the United States produced 1 million barrels more of oil than it produced in 2012. And in 2012, it produced 1 million barrels of oil more than it produced in 2011. In about 5 years, the United States is probably going to be the world's largest oil producer, beyond Saudi Arabia. Just to give you a sense that we have built, years ago, we built all sorts of LNG, liquefied natural gas terminals, so we could import liquefied natural gas from the Middle East. We've now retooled those terminals so we can export liquefied natural gas because of the shale gas explosion throughout the United States. It's also just interesting as an aside, all of this happened not out of dictates from government, but just happened because it happened. It was technological innovation in the field in certain states in the Midwest, small private sector companies, and it just took off. It really is quite an extraordinary transformation. Virtually nobody saw it coming. It's already had a big impact on our American national security in terms of we no longer nearly as dependent as we were on imports, obviously. We still have to import some because of the risk of getting technical here. The way our refineries are oriented. Oil is not oil. Different types of refineries are geared towards certain types of sulfur contents and the rest. So the United States is self-sufficient in the net, which is not to say that it's totally independent, and we're obviously not independent in another sense. We can't wall ourselves off from the consequences of global interruptions of supply or price changes, particularly in the area of oil, because of our economic interdependence with the rest of the world. So I don't much like the phrase energy independence. I much prefer the phrase energy self-sufficiency. What does it give us? I think it gives us a little bit of cushion, certainly from price fluctuations or even short-term supply interruptions. So the United States has much more cushion. We have this large strategic petroleum reserve. The odds that we'd ever have to resort to it have gone down markedly. Then I think so that's probably one big change. Again, is this a slight insulation or cushion? Has it? It's given us, I think, more latitude in the case of a country like Iran. Obviously, we put tremendous sanctions on Iran in order to get them to curtail their nuclear program. Iran's ability, for example, to have taken a certain amount of oil off the market in the hope of raising the price of oil, so it would therefore maintain the same level of revenues. The fact that we were able to put several million more barrels a day of oil on stream made it much more difficult for Iran to do what I think it otherwise would have done. So one of the reasons that the talks between the world and Iran over its nuclear program have shown the promise they have, I don't know what's going to happen, but have shown at least the promise that they have, is because of this. That I think what the United States has done is somewhat reduce the energy weapon there. I think it's made it more difficult for other producers, including Russia and others. It's kept prices down. The Russian economy the last 2 years has barely been up. I think it's up like between 1% and 2% growth only. So any cash crop economy around the world that's essentially oil and gas dependent, much less leverage than it used to have. So I don't think, again, it's transforming of the U.S. relationship with the world, but I do think it's given us more options and more flexibility than we had, and I think it's somewhat constrained or limited some of the leverage and options of some of the energy producers. So again, I think for all that, it's good. There's an article, by the way, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, which is the magazine my organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, publishes. And if you're all, the students here, if you're not regular readers of Foreign Affairs, you should be. Shame on you. But in the current issue, which is what? The March-April issue, there's a very good article by two of our scholars on just this point, on what are the strategic consequences, if you will, of the energy transformation. One of the things it's done, by the way, for the United States is it's reversed some of the decline in American manufacturing. Oil has a global price, but for those of you who don't follow energy issues closely, natural gas doesn't. Natural gas, if you will, is much more locally priced. The price of natural gas in much of the United States is about a quarter, about 25% of what it is, say, in this part of the world. Well, think about the comparative advantage that gives to manufacturing in the United States. We don't have to move it, and when we pay for it locally, it's considerably, it's an order, 25% the cost. So suddenly we're seeing certain types of industries come back, which has all sorts of consequences. So the consequences of this, I think, are quite large.
Dr. Haass, thank you much for your talk. My name is Adel Ghaffar. I'm a PhD student at the Center of Arab and Islamic Studies here at the ANU. I want to ask a Middle East-related question. Since the ouster of President Morsi in Egypt last year, there seems to be inconsistency in U.S. foreign policy there. specifically with regards to the State Department having a certain approach and the White House having a certain approach to the events that have unfolded. And of course, regionally, we've seen Qatar on one hand supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar and Turkey on the other hand. We have Saudi Arabia, the Emirates and Kuwait supporting the military regime. So I just wanted to ask you, A, to comment on this inconsistency, and B, to actually see, in your opinion, what should be the right approach of foreign policy to Egypt.
Egypt is extraordinarily difficult. And I'm not going to duck your question. I just think it's, and I don't think the United States has gotten it right at several points. I believe, though I should say also, I worked on this for years. And as I said before, there's nothing more difficult in the foreign policy business, for those of you who are contemplating it, than to try to tell other countries how they ought to run themselves. And for years, I was in meetings with President Mubarak and others in Egypt where I was encouraging certain types of reform, particularly economic as well as political. And I would say we had limited success on the economic side and virtually no success on the political side. Egypt became as brittle as it was. I think the United States did err in the last days of Mubarak, and I thought in pushing him, I think we should have been, after you stand with someone for 30 years, I don't believe that we handled the final days of Mr. Mubarak well. We didn't get, it didn't help us in Egypt, and it caused tremendous problems for America's relations elsewhere, particularly in the Sunni world. We did then try to create an environment where you would have a more politically competitive Egypt. My hunch is though things moved way too fast. And I think the United States, to some extent, confused what I would describe as electocracy with democracy. To me, elections ought to come as the caboose of democratic transformation, not as the engine. Egypt lacked certain elements of civil society, didn't have a constitution in place that was widely supported, and so forth. And to move to elections, I thought prematurely, was a strategic error. In any case, it happened. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists got together the lion's share of the vote. You had the Morsi government. And what Mr. Morsi then did in power was create tremendous concerns among many Egyptians, to use the old cliche that it was one man, one vote, and all too possibly one time. And there was concern about what seemed to be the consolidation of power, the way the Constitution was going to be written, what was happening to civil society, the Islamization of the society. So a lot of people feared that if Mr. Morsi were allowed to run through his elected term, it would be that, and that would be it. That by then the playing field would have been so tilted that even if there were a new round of elections, it would be, if you will, it just simply wouldn't be fair. Things would have been so distorted that you would essentially have unchecked power. You then had the massive uprisings in Egypt, and the United States wasn't sure. You're right. I'm not sure what so much inconsistency is. The United States and different officials had a very different reaction. There were those who saying Mr. Morsi was elected, however imperfectly he was elected, and however imperfectly he ruled, but there are those who said he was elected. We should stand by him. And there are those who said how he was elected and how he ruled, he lost what the Chinese might call the mandate of heaven. And he lost popular legitimacy, and we had to respect that. And if you sense there was a bit of a tug of war, you're right. That was exactly the case. And sometimes when the word dilemma is overused, in this case it was a bit of a dilemma. Because whichever way we went, if we had called it a coup, we would have infuriated a large number of Egyptians and alienated the military. By not calling it a coup, we infuriated others. And at the moment, the United States seems to have succeeded in angering Egyptians, both the supporters of the Muslim Brothers and the others. We're actually a unifying force in Egypt, somewhat unintentionally. It reinforces my sense of how hard it is to do these things. And I think what the United States has basically done is taken a step back. And we're saying, we're going to see how Egyptians sort this out. And I think that's probably right. That I think sometimes you got to take a step back. Again, there's nothing more difficult than trying to jump in with both feet to these sorts of things, to give the Egyptians a little bit of time and space to work things out. Now, all that said, I'm not real confident about the way things are being worked out. You had the collapse of the government you saw the other day in Egypt. What worries me about it is increasingly, and I say this without tremendous sympathy for the Muslim Brothers about their agenda or how they acted when they had power, but I do think now there's a danger by forcing them increasingly underground, it will become a self-fulfilling policy. And that people who don't feel they have a real chance within traditional politics will then go to non-traditional ways. So I think Egypt is sowing the seeds at a minimum of increasing violence down the road, a polarized society which is punctuated by violence. I'm not smart enough to predict the degree of violence and whether it grows to the point of real, if you will, social instability and dysfunctionality. I would not rule that out. But I just feel that Egypt, which is an enormous, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the Arab world, that Egypt has not yet found a sustainable trajectory out of where it was. And look at the lurches. You had Mubarakism to the Muslim Brotherhood, now back to, if you will, what's going to be Sisiism. This is the next phase of Egypt. We've had, if you will, 3 top-heavy Egypts in a row. And that's where we are now. And I still feel that things are not sorted out. And my hunch is the United States and others are going to have to give the Egyptians some time and space. But I don't think it's going to be smooth, and I don't think it's going to be quick. So I don't have a good or easy answer for you. No, yes, you promised her the microphone.
My name is Rosemary Ganley, and my organisation is the United Services Institute.
What is that?
You might know it as RUSI.
Oh, RUSI. I knew that in London.
Yes. Yeah. In the ACT, we've taken the royal bit off.
Does that mean like you don't watch Downton Abbey or something? What?
When you put up your model at the end, you said it might be worth discussing. The word we didn't hear was China. You will be aware that we're thinking about who we work with and how we... One of the things I've never heard in any of the conversations about all of this is, what do the general population of the United States feel about all of this? We hear academics... Well, United States relationship with China. Does the average person going to vote, or the average person talking about foreign policy in the United States at the moment, while they're worried about less armed forces and cutting budgets and the Congress being worth watching, what do the populace of the United States want us to do about China?
Okay, well, see, it's good you're sitting down now. But just the other day, the Gallup organization put out a poll, the answers to a poll, and they went to a couple of thousand Americans as a sampling, and basically says, what is your biggest concern? And the top, I think, was jobs or something like that, whatever, schools, crime, whatever. Nowhere in the top 10 was anything to do with foreign policy. So based on that poll, I have no idea what the answer is. And that's I think what's going on in the United States, and it's actually serious, is you've got, as I mentioned before, the growth of, there's actually 2 kinds of isolationism. And there's what I think out loud here, which is always dangerous, but bear with me for a second. One is what you might call conscious, assertive isolation, that you've looked at the foreign policy and national security debate and you say, for whatever reason, we don't want to be involved in the world, and we're going to turn our focus here at home. And you're seeing some of that from Rand Paul and others. And there's a whole American political tradition of that. And I think it becomes, and they would resent the term isolationism, but it takes an extremely narrow view of American interests in the world. And by the way, this crosses political lines. We see it on the left, we see it on the right. And and then you have a different kind of isolation, which isn't so much considered. It's just that you don't care about the world. So it's not that you wake up in the world and say we have too much foreign policy. You wake up in the morning and you just don't think about foreign policy. And we're beginning to see more of that. And there's lots of reasons. Our media doesn't cover it as well. Our schools don't teach it, and so forth. So we have this, but you have both dynamics, I think, at work. So it's hard to answer your question, what do we think about China and all that. That said, when I talked about Asia, a lot of that was code for China. I don't think, again, this part of the world is going to sort itself out. The United States has had a hedging policy towards China that we try to deal with it where we can, but we basically have the capacity, latent or sometimes active, to push back where we decide we must. And the whole thrust, the pivot, was triggered by China, more than anything else, by a pattern of greater Chinese assertiveness several years ago. And I don't see where that assertiveness has disappeared. So my concern about our foreign policy is the pivot has not been realized. And that's why, again, I think it's essential that we do increase our air and naval presence, we do increase our diplomatic activity, and we do pass Trade Promotion Authority, which is a precursor for American support for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I think it's, I don't want countries in this part of the world to feel that they have to essentially give way to China, given its scale, its size. And I don't want countries in this part of the world to think they've got to take matters into their own hand and have a fairly confrontational policy with China. I want them to feel that there's an alternative, which is working closely with the United States, that helps provide for their security. And I want the Chinese, their leadership, when they get up in the morning, to see that. And I want that to reduce the temptation for China to act assertively. But I think that outcome only happens if the United States is more involved than it has been.
Yep. My name is Firuze from National Security College here in the ANU. It seems that the United States really about to go pivoting to Asia to the east, but it seems that Asia is going to pivot to west, because their economic growth is dependent to the, for example, to the Middle Eastern resources, oil and gas, because they're not self-sufficient like the US. And they're looking at what was the legacy of American foreign policy during last decade in the Middle East. So it's a mark of the foreign policy of the US. So what would be your response to this sort of argument?
I'm not sure I quite, so let me try to answer. If I don't get it right, come back at me.
Those who are arguing that Asia, East is going to pivot to West. So
well, I don't think it can
what
pivot.
Do you think?
I think your basic premise is right, that many of the countries in Asia are going to be reliant on imports of energy from the Middle East. That's true. I don't think there's any way around that, so long as we largely have oil and gas driven, no pun intended, economies. Indeed, if anything, it's going to become much greater. If you look at trajectories, not just of Chinese and Indian growth, but the rise of middle classes in China and India, the growth of automobiles and so forth, the thirst for oil is going to continue to increase, and there's only one place that can satisfy it. Well, but mostly satisfy it, which will be the Middle East. Plus, the response to what happened in Japan with the nuclear reactor has slowed down, if not stopped, the nuclear power industry in much of the world. So, but what I think you have is an odd situation strategically. You have greater dependence of countries in this part of the world on the Middle East, but they're not doing a lot to promote stability in the Middle East. And I think there's a slight disconnect. And I've had conversations with government officials in some of these countries where I basically said, you've depended upon the United States to provide, in some ways, strategic order in the Middle East. And, the first question was about what are the repercussions of the American energy transformation. We'll still do that to some extent. The American interest in the Middle East was not for commercial gain. It was for strategic stability because of the importance of oil. But some of that importance was to ourselves directly. Now it's much less. So if I were in the rest of the world, I would be thinking more about what they may have to do to help promote stability in the Middle East, which is no easy task. But I think the era in which everyone else could count on the United States to do whatever it took to maintain stability in the oil-producing areas, I don't think is realistic given our situation. Even more that the threats to stability in the oil-producing areas in the future are less likely to be what Saddam did to Kuwait, much more likely to be internal disarray and that's much harder for outside countries to contend with. So I think it's actually a source of some economic and strategic uncertainty for countries in this part of the world.
One last question over. Are we good?
Yeah, Bates, we got a few minutes. We can go to 5:20. Yeah, come on. I'll give shorter answers. I apologize.
The Department of Defence, but this is really just a sort of a personal interest question. You'll think about the sort of fuel independence of the US as sort of a big economic change, but perhaps there's an even bigger one coming, which is kind of a labour independence of the economy. And that makes a shift from kind of going to where the cheap labour is to going to where the value of the market is. Do you sort of agree with that view, or what's the strategic implications of that? That would suggest to me a rebalance away from cheap labour markets to high-value wealth markets, which is probably good for the US and not so good for poorer countries.
I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. I would simply say, look, the biggest driver in employment is technology and technological innovation, even more than globalization. So I think we're at a point where technology and productivity gains are reducing traditional employment. We can't, there's nowhere you can't survive as a society or thrive as a society with enormous percentages or numbers of your people out of work, which means that to some extent, the one area of employment growth on a large scale is services. So we'll become more of a service-oriented. And there's certain types of employment, if you read Michael Spence, there's certain types of jobs that are substitutable or tradable, and there are those that are not. I mean, if you're flipping a hamburger, that's not, so you can't outsource the flipping of a hamburger to somebody in India. That's got to be done locally. But if there's other things like reading X-rays that you can outsource, or doing certain types of office tasks during the night. So I think so certain types of jobs will be just competition. So for the United States, it probably means greater employment in the service sector. And it's going to put tremendous pressure on us, and this is going to be true for Australia too, to remake our educational systems. I actually think one of the most interesting challenges for advanced societies is to rethink education. I mean, a lot of you are young, you're here in ANU, that's great, but let me give you something depressing. It's my job in life is to depress you. If you think, however good the education is, this could be the best university in the world, and it is one, it's a great university. But if you think whatever you learn here is going to be enough to see you through, think again. There's no way that what you learn here, and I don't care if you're the best student in the world and you got the best professors in the world, there's no way it's going to see you through the next 30 or 40, 50 years of your employable life. And what we need is advanced societies, but even any societies, we need to have lifelong learning. We need to have the mechanisms, we need to have the financial arrangements, and so forth, so people at various stages of their career can get retrained. Because you're going to probably go through, I don't know what the statistics are in Australia, but the average person's career now is something like 8 or 10 jobs. Because technology is coming along, global competition comes along, and the job you had no longer exists. But in order to move from job to job to job, you're going to have to get retrained. And in many cases, jobs have to be redefined because a lot of other people are coming on stream around the world who can do those things more cheaply, where there are substitution effects. So you have to move up the complexity scale. And that's going to take education. So I actually think, I'm not sure if I'm being responsive or not to your question, but I actually think we have to rethink the entire concept of employment and where's the competition coming from and how to sustain it over the arc of a lifetime. And I would simply say that most societies, we haven't come close to doing that, and we've got to do it. In our country, one of the things we're seeing is the social dangers that happens when people are out of work for more than 6 months, and the consequences for families and so forth. So it's one thing if you're 25 years old or something happens and you go back to school or whatever, but if you're 45 or 50, very, very, very tough. And one of the, given longer lifespans though, was probably going to be the squeeze on entitlements. We're all going to have to figure out as societies how to people basically between the ages of roughly 40 and 70, what is going to be the mechanism for continuing to make them employable? And I actually think that's an enormous challenge for societies.
Thank you, Richard. I'm sure you don't remember, but you gave some time to me in the fall of 2011 for an interview. At that time, we spoke about doctrine, and you said that doctrine had to have meaningful linkages to decision making.
Had to have meaningful what?
Meaningful linkages to decision making. So doctrine had to have real consequences for resource allocation, priorities, etc. It couldn't just be a wish list or a catalogue of what's important. You may reject the categorisation, but the national security strategy of 2010 perhaps resembled the latter more than the former. As we eagerly anticipate NSS 2014, what do you think that document will look like? Will restoration be a key tenet of that? And will that document provide those first order approximations?
Well, my hunch is whenever we put out a national security doctrine, we're really talking much more about a foreign policy doctrine. We're not talking so much as the balance between the domestic and the internationals within the international. And we've actually got a pretty good doctrine on foreign policy right now. The problem is we're not implementing it. And it's the rebalance. One of the oddities of American foreign policy is over the last couple of years, the United States developed and articulated, again, a slightly different approach. More emphasis towards this part of the world, slightly less in the Middle East, but our foreign policy hasn't caught up with it. So what I would hope is we would do just that. Now, we're seeing elements of it. What Chuck Hagel, the Secretary of Defense, announced the other day, we're seeing the reduction in American land forces. And I think that suggests that there's not going to be anything like what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan again, but probably the marginal defense dollar will go more into air and naval forces. So I think that reflects, again, a certain bias towards this part of the world. What I'm hoping, again, is our diplomacy catches up and reorients itself. It's not there yet, but that's something that's easier to turn. In terms of the more basic national security, I think it's kind of out there, what I would call restoration, but putting a greater emphasis on home. I think that's there. The problem is we're not doing it right. We haven't touched entitlement obligations, which is a real danger down the road. You know, one of the great things about demography is you can see where it's heading. You know where your society is going to be in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. The problem we're facing is we know where our demography is going to be, but our policy hasn't begun to adjust that. But we don't consider that national security. And what I'm trying to do is expand the debate about national security and to get people to see these trade-offs and to see the connections. Indeed, I even take back the word trade-off. We're in such a good position. We could do all that we need to do in the world and do all that we need to do at home. There's not a guns versus butter trade-off. It's almost always true. One of the axioms of public policy is it's not how much you spend, it's how you spend it. So the United States could have a better foreign policy, a better domestic policy, much stronger national security overall, and it wouldn't cost more. We just do certain things differently. And to me, the biggest question mark, again, is our politics. Whether our politics allow us to do it. I don't think the next couple of years are going to be pretty. We're going to end up, we're going to have midterm elections in 6 months. The government is probably going to be even more divided than it is now. You'll then be entering the last 25% of Mr. Obama's presidency. Never a time where presidents have a lot of sway domestically. And so I think it's, we'll see what happens with the next president. But I think the big idea out there in foreign policy after Iraq and Afghanistan is, again, and given the continuing disarray in the Middle East, is to somehow figure out a way to distance ourselves a little bit from it and to put greater emphasis on this part of the world, greater emphasis hopefully dealing on some global issues. I think the danger in the Middle East is going to be what you might call the Afghanization of the Middle East. And as I said before, I think the real danger for American national security is going to be how to deal with weak states that can't or won't police their own territory and terrorists gaining footholds in many more places, whether it's Libya, Syria, Iraq, what have you. And I think the challenge is going to be for us to respond to that without once again allowing the Middle East to dominate our foreign policy. So my hope, I'm not sure if it's my prediction, but my hope is that you have a kind of, again, making good on the pivot would be my hope for what the next national security strategy will be. But we'll see.
I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Richard Haass for his excellent remarks and for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Education, interaction, understanding. This is APAC, Australia's public affairs channel.